After falling from grace, a once wealthy woman discovers hope in an unexpected place: her former chauffeur's surprising offer. And if you cherish your family and love videos like this, subscribe to our channel to have 10 years of luck in your life. The cameras flashed incessantly as David Hargrove walked down the marble steps of his family's Manhattan mansion for the last time. Security guards formed a barrier between him and the aggressive reporters who shouted questions about the collapse of Hargrove Industries. David gripped his leather suitcase, the only possession he'd chosen to take. While maintaining a stoic expression he perfected over years of board meetings. "Mr. Hargrove, what happened to the pension funds? Did you know about your father's illegal investments? Where will you go now?" David ignored the questions, though each one felt like a physical blow. The company car, his last taste of luxury, waited at the curb. As he slid into the back seat, his driver Thomas, who had served the family for 20 years, gave him a sympathetic nod through the rearview mirror. The drive to the bus station marked the end of his life as he knew it. 4 hours later, David stepped off the bus in Millbrook, a small town he'd randomly selected on the map. The station consisted of little more than a concrete platform and a weather-beaten bench. A handful of locals waited for their buses, stealing glances at his expensive suit and designer luggage. David quickly learned that news of his family's downfall had reached even this remote corner of the state. The walk to his new apartment took 15 minutes. Each step on the cracked sidewalk reminded him of the manicured paths of Central Park. The building's superintendent, Mrs. Henderson, barely looked up from her magazine as she handed him the keys to apartment 3B. The elevator was out of order. It had been for months, she informed him, so David carried his suitcase up 3 flights of stairs. The apartment was exactly what $800 a month could buy in Millbrook. A studio with water stains on the ceiling, a kitchenette with mismatched appliances, and a window that overlooked the parking lot of a discount furniture store. David placed his suitcase on the worn carpet and sat on the edge of the bed, which creaked under his weight. The reality of his situation hit him with full force. The next morning, David ventured out to stock his empty kitchen. The local market was nothing like the gourmet shops he frequented in Manhattan. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as he navigated narrow aisles, checking prices on every item, a new and uncomfortable habit. While examining the cost of generic cereal, David nearly collided with another shopper. "I'm sorry," he started to say, looking up to meet the steady gaze of a woman in her early 30s. She wore simple clothes and carried a basket filled with carefully selected items, each one clearly chosen with a budget in mind. "No harm done," she replied, her voice carrying a hint of warmth despite her reserved demeanor. A young girl, perhaps 7 or 8, clutched the woman's free hand, watching David with undisguised curiosity. "Mommy, isn't he the man from the news?" the girl asked loudly, causing several nearby shoppers to turn and stare. The woman, Sarah, as David would later learn, hushed her daughter gently. "Emily, remember what we discussed about privacy?" She gave David an apologetic look, but there was something else in her expression, understanding, perhaps, or recognition of a shared experience with life's hardships. David managed a small smile, though the interaction left him unsettled. As he watched Sarah guide her daughter toward the checkout counter, he noticed the careful way she counted out her money, the gentle patience with which she answered Emily's questions, and the quiet dignity she maintained despite what seemed to be modest circumstances. The brief encounter stuck with him throughout the day. In Sarah's bearing, he recognized something he desperately needed to learn: how to carry on with grace when life stripped away everything familiar. It was a stark contrast to the pitying looks and barely concealed disdain he'd received from others since arriving in Millbrook. The job search proved more demoralizing than David had anticipated. He sat in the local diner, spreading newspapers across the sticky tabletop and circling potential opportunities. His resume, once impressive with its Harvard MBA and executive positions, now worked against him. Every interview ended the same way. "You're overqualified," said the manager at the local bank, not meeting David's eyes. Translation: they didn't trust someone who'd been involved in a financial scandal. "We're looking for someone with more relevant experience," explained the owner of a car dealership, despite David's years of sales expertise. Translation: they feared he'd leave as soon as something better came along. By the end of his second week in Millbrook, David had been rejected from 12 positions. He sat on a bench in the town square, loosening his tie, the same one he'd worn to close million-dollar deals, and watched locals hurry past. Some recognized him. Their whispers weren't particularly subtle. "Excuse me." A familiar voice broke through his thoughts. Sarah Mitchell stood before him, holding a stack of papers. "Mind if I sit?" David gestured to the empty space beside him, noticing she wore a name tag from the local library. She glanced at his newspaper, the job listing circled in red ink. "No luck?" she asked, her directness catching him off guard. "Apparently, my qualifications make me uniquely unqualified for everything in town," David replied, attempting humor but unable to hide his frustration. Sarah sorted through her own papers' job applications. He realized. "You're approaching it wrong," she said, not unkindly. "You're still trying to be David Hargrove, former CEO. And who should I be instead?" "Just David," she answered simply. "Someone willing to learn new things. Someone who sees value in starting over." She paused, considering her next words. "When Tom, my husband, died last year, I kept trying to be the same person I was before. It took me months to realize that wasn't possible." The revelation hung between them. David studied her more carefully now, noting the wedding ring she still wore and the tired determination in her eyes. "The library's looking for someone to help digitize their archives," Sarah continued. "It's part-time, minimum wage. Nothing like what you're used to, but—" She shrugged. "Sometimes you need to build a new foundation before you can rebuild your life." David took the application she offered, something shifting in his perspective. "Your husband, if you don't mind me asking." "Cancer," Sarah answered, her voice steady but soft. "He was a high school teacher. We had insurance, but medical bills—" She straightened her shoulders. "You learn to adapt. Emily and I, we're managing." The conversation revealed layers to Sarah that David hadn't expected. Her strength wasn't born from natural resilience, but from necessity. She'd faced her own financial struggles, her own public scrutiny as the widow of a beloved local teacher. "How do you do it?" David asked, the question escaping before he could stop it. "Start over?" Sarah stood, gathering her papers. "You stop thinking about what you lost and start focusing on what you can build." She smiled slightly. "And you learn to accept help when it's offered. The library application is due tomorrow. They open at 9. As she walked away, David realized it was the first conversation he'd had since arriving in Millbrook where he felt seen as a person rather than a cautionary tale. Sarah's advice, born from her own experience with loss and adaptation, carried more weight than all the business strategy he'd learned at Harvard. The next morning, David arrived at the library at 8:45, wearing a simple button-down shirt instead of his usual suit. Through the window, he saw Sarah at the front desk, helping an elderly patron with a computer. She caught his eye and nodded slightly, an acknowledgement of his first step toward building something new. The Golden Spoon Diner wasn't exactly the kind of establishment where David had imagined himself working. After the library position fell through due to budget cuts, he'd taken Sarah's advice about starting anywhere. Now he stood behind the counter, struggling to operate the ancient coffee machine while regular customers watched with barely concealed amusement. "Order up!" Charlie, the cook, shouted through the service window. David grabbed the plates, trying to remember which table had ordered what. His hands, once steady during million-dollar negotiations, now shook slightly as he balanced 3 breakfast specials. "Hargrove!" A voice cut through the morning bustle. David turned to find Marcus Wheeler, his former VP of operations, standing at the counter in an expensive suit. The diner fell quiet as other customers sensed the tension. "Quite a change from the executive dining room, isn't it?" Marcus smirked, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Though I suppose serving coffee is better than serving time like your father." David's grip tightened on the coffee pot. Before he could respond, Betty, the veteran waitress, stepped between them. "Either order something or leave, sir. We're busy." After Marcus left, David retreated to the storage room, his face burning. He loosened his apron, considering walking out when the door opened. Sarah stood there, Emily at her side. "Your regular customers are worried about their coffee fix," she said, holding out a fresh apron. "Apparently, you make the best cup in town." David snorted. "They're being kind. I'm terrible at this." "You're learning," Sarah corrected. Just like I had to learn to fix a leaking faucet and balance books for the library. Nobody's born knowing everything. Emily tugged at her mother's sleeve. Can Mr. David make me a chocolate milk? He does the swirly thing with the syrup. The simple request, delivered with childlike enthusiasm, pulled David back to reality. He tied on the fresh apron and followed them out. Throughout his shift, he noticed how Sarah interacted with other customers. Her genuine interest in their lives. Her ability to make everyone feel heard. During his break, Sarah invited him to join her and Emily at their booth. I'm starting a community support group, she explained, spreading out some flyers. For people going through major life changes. Would you consider sharing your experience? My experience of failing spectacularly? David asked dryly. Your experience of starting over, Sarah corrected. There's a difference. As they discussed the project, David found himself opening up about his struggles. Not just the practical challenges of his new life, but the emotional toll of losing his identity. Sarah listened without judgment, occasionally offering insights from her own journey. The hardest part, she admitted, helping Emily with her homework while they talked, is letting go of who you thought you'd be. After Tom died, I had to reimagine everything. Some days, I still expect him to walk through the door, telling me about his students' latest projects. David watched her help Emily solve a math problem, noting the patient way she guided her daughter through each step. It was the same patience she'd shown him, helping him navigate his new reality. Later that evening, as David closed up the diner, he found himself thinking about Sarah's community project. His old self would have dismissed such grassroots efforts as insignificant. Now, he understood the value of small victories, of human connections formed over coffee and shared struggles. Charlie appeared beside him, handing him a takeout container. You're getting better, rich boy, the cook said gruffly. Give it time. The container held a slice of apple pie, Sarah and Emily's favorite. On the house. Drop it by the library on your way home. The community center's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as David helped Sarah arrange folding chairs in a circle. The weekly support group had grown from 5 participants to 15, each person carrying their own story of loss, change, or starting over. Remember, Sarah said, adjusting the last chair, you don't have to share everything. Just what feels right. David nodded, his throat tight. He'd spent the previous night rehearsing what to say, but now, facing the empty chairs, his practiced words felt inadequate. As people began filing in, he recognized familiar faces. Betty from the diner, struggling with retirement. Mike, a former factory worker dealing with disability. Younger folks grappling with student debt and career changes. When it was his turn to speak, David surprised himself with his honesty. A month ago, I couldn't imagine life without status symbols. My identity was so wrapped up in success that failure felt like death. He paused, meeting Sarah's encouraging gaze. But someone taught me that starting over isn't failure. It's an opportunity to build something authentic. The group's response was unexpected. Instead of judgment, they offered understanding. A young woman shared how she'd lost her startup and moved back in with her parents. An elderly man described rebuilding his life after bankruptcy. Their stories echoed David's experience, creating a tapestry of shared resilience. After the meeting, as they cleaned up, David found himself watching Sarah. She moved with quiet confidence, touching people's shoulders, offering words of encouragement. Something had shifted in how he saw her. It wasn't just admiration for her strength anymore. You're staring, Sarah said, catching his eye as she stacked the last chair. I'm observing, David corrected, feeling warmth spread across his face. There's a difference. Sarah's laugh, rare and genuine, made his heart skip. But then Emily ran up, showing her mother a drawing she'd made during the meeting, and David saw Sarah's expression soften in that special way reserved for her daughter. It reminded him of the complexity of their situation. Later that week, during a quiet moment at the diner, David caught himself daydreaming about Sarah. He imagined taking her to dinner, not at some fancy restaurant like he would have in his old life, but maybe to the Italian place down the street where the owner made everything from scratch. Then he pictured Emily's face and felt a wave of uncertainty. Was he ready to be part of a family? Was Sarah ready to let someone new into hers? Sarah visited the diner daily, usually during his shift. They developed a comfortable routine. She'd help Emily with homework while he served customers, occasionally joining them during breaks. Today, she looked tired, the kind of exhaustion that came from carrying too much for too long. "Everything okay?" he asked, sliding into their booth. "Just life," she replied, but her smile didn't reach her eyes. "Emily's father-daughter dance is coming up at school. She says she doesn't want to go, but..." The unspoken weight of Tom's absence hung between them. David felt an overwhelming urge to offer solutions, to fix things, an old habit from his corporate days. Instead, he just listened, understanding that sometimes presence meant more than answers. As closing time approached, David watched Sarah gather Emily's books, noted how she straightened her shoulders before stepping out into the evening. He wanted to tell her how he felt, how she'd become more than just his guide to this new life. But the timing felt wrong, the risk too great. The community center's transformation for the fundraising event surprised even David. String lights hung from exposed beams, borrowed tablecloths covered folding tables, and local businesses had donated enough food and drinks to feed half the town. Sarah stood beside him, Revy, wing their checklist one final time. "You didn't have to handle all this yourself," she said, noting his exhaustion. David had spent weeks organizing the event, leveraging what remained of his business acumen to secure donations and sponsors. "I wanted to," he replied simply. The truth was he needed to prove, to himself as much as anyone, that he could create something valuable without his family's wealth or connections. The evening started well. Community members filled the space, many bringing additional dishes and decorations. David watched Sarah work the room, introducing people, sharing stories of how the support group had helped others. She wore a simple blue dress, nothing like the designer outfits he'd seen at Manhattan galas, but she carried herself with natural elegance that drew people in. "You've done good work here, David," Mayor Thompson said, clapping him on the shoulder. "This is exactly what Millbrook needed." Then James Morton walked in. David recognized his former business partner immediately. The same sharp suit, the same predatory smile. James scanning the room like he was assessing assets for liquidation. "David Hargrove," James announced loudly enough to draw attention. "Playing small-town hero? How precious." Sarah appeared at David's side, her presence steadying. "Can I help you find something, sir?" James ignored her, focusing on David. "Does your new community know the whole story? About the pension funds? The offshore accounts?" His voice carried across the now quiet room. "About how you knew what was happening months before the collapse?" David's hands clenched. Every accusation struck like a physical blow, but it was the growing whispers around him that hurt most. He'd worked so hard to build trust here. "I think you should leave," Sarah said, her voice firm. "This is a private event." James smiled coldly. "Of course. I just thought people should know who they're dealing with. A man who let hundreds lose their retirement savings while his family hid millions overseas." "That's not what happened," David started, but James was already walking out, leaving chaos in his wake. People whispered, some openly staring, others avoiding eye contact entirely. Sarah touched his arm. "David, I need air," he managed, heading for the back door. Outside, he leaned against the brick wall, breathing heavily. The night air felt thick, suffocating. Everything he'd built here suddenly felt precarious. Sarah followed him out. She waited, giving him space to collect himself. "I didn't know about the pension funds," he finally said, "but I suspected something was wrong. I should have looked closer, asked more questions. My father..." He stopped, the weight of responsibility crushing him anew. "Why didn't you tell me?" Sarah asked quietly. "Because for the first time in my life, someone saw me as just David. Not as a Hargrove, not as a failed businessman, just me." He turned to face her. "I was afraid of losing that." Sarah was silent for a long moment. "When Tom got sick, I told everyone he was getting better. I knew the truth, but saying it out loud made it real." She moved closer, her voice gentle but firm. "We all have things we're afraid to face, David. But hiding from them doesn't make them disappear." Inside, they could hear the event continuing, though subdued. Everything they'd worked for seemed tainted now, colored by James's revelations. The week following the fundraiser, David threw himself into work at the diner, taking extra shifts and avoiding the concerned looks from regular customers. He stopped attending the support group meetings, sending Sarah brief messages about needing space. Each time she came to the diner, he found reasons to be in the kitchen or storage room. Late one evening, as he wiped down tables, Sarah entered alone, unusual without Emily. She sat at the counter, waiting until the last customer left. "This isn't working," she said plainly. "You can't just disappear. I'm protecti." "In you," David replied, not meeting her eyes. "Your reputation in this town matters. The library board, Emily's school, they all know about the fundraiser now." "Stop." Sarah's voice was sharp. "I don't need protection. I need you to be honest with me." David finally looked at her. The exhaustion on her face made him realize his withdrawal had affected more than just himself. "The things James said are in the past," Sarah interrupted. "Just like my grief over Tom, just like the months I spent angry at him for leaving us with medical bills, just like the nights I cried because Emily asked when Daddy was coming home." Her voice cracked slightly. "We all have darkness, David. The question is whether we let it define us." He sat heavily in the booth across from her. "I dream about it sometimes," he admitted. "The day we discovered what my father had done. Hundreds of employees gathering in the lobby, demanding answers I couldn't give. Their faces, some had worked for us for decades. And you feel responsible. I was the CEO. I should have known." Sarah was quiet for a moment. "The night before Tom died, he made me promise to be happy again. I was so angry with him for asking that. How dare he expect me to move on?" She twisted her wedding ring. "It took me a year to understand he wasn't asking me to forget him. He was asking me to live." David reached across the table, hesitating before taking her hand. It was the first time they'd touched beyond casual contact. "How did you do it?" "Move forward. One day at a time. Some days I failed completely. But I had Emily. She needed me to be strong, so I learned to be." Sarah squeezed his hand. "The thing is, strength isn't about being perfect. It's about continuing even when you're not." "I see the way people look at me now," David said. "Like they're waiting for me to prove James right. Then prove him wrong. Not by hiding, but by staying. By showing up at the support group. By continuing to help others." She paused. "By trusting that some people might understand more than you think." The diner was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and distant traffic. David realized he was still holding Sarah's hand, and she hadn't pulled away. "I miss you," she said softly. "Emily keeps asking why you don't make her chocolate milk anymore." The mention of Emily brought a fresh wave of guilt. "I never meant to hurt either of you." "I know." Sarah stood, but didn't let go of his hand. "Come back to the group. Face whatever comes next. But do it because you want to heal, not because you're running from something." As she turned to leave, David found his voice. "Sarah," she paused at the door. "Thank you for seeing me, the real me." Her smile, though tinged with sadness, held warmth. "Just remember to see yourself that way too." David's attempt to contact his old network in New York proved futile. Former colleagues who once laughed at his jokes and sought his advice now sent their assistants to decline his calls. Each rejection reinforced how completely his old world had abandoned him. "We regret to inform you that Mr. Peterson is unavailable," another assistant recited mechanically over the phone. David sat in his apartment, staring at the list of names he'd once called friends. Only 3 remained uncrossed. The community center needed funds for basic repairs. The roof leaked, the heating system worked sporadically, and the computer lab, essential for job seekers, ran on donated machines from the previous decade. The fundraiser money, though helpful, barely covered operating costs. A knock at his door interrupted his brooding. Sarah stood there looking troubled. "Do you have a minute?" Inside, she paced his small living room. "Emily's teacher called today. Some kids have been difficult, making comments about her not having a father, about us being poor." She stopped, running her hands through her hair. "One boy told her we're only pretending to help people because we're both Ozers who couldn't make it in the real world." David felt anger rise in his chest. Kids can be cruel. It's not just the kids. It's their parents. Ever since the fundraiser, Sarah sat heavily on his worn couch. "They're questioning everything we've built." The support group, the community programs. Someone even suggested I step down from the library board. He joined her on the couch, maintaining a careful distance. Because of your association with me. Because they're scared, Sarah corrected. It's easier to judge others than face their own vulnerabilities. She pulled out a crumpled paper from her bag. Emily's latest art project, torn at the edges. She tried throwing this away, said there's no point in drawing anymore. David studied the drawing, a colorful scene of the community center, stick figures holding hands in a circle. At the center stood two taller figures and a smaller one between them. The simplicity of it made his throat tight. We can't let them win, he said finally. Not the bullies, not James, not any of them. Sarah looked at him, surprised by his determination. What do you suggest? We go to the school. Talk about bullying, about loss, about change. Not just to the kids, but to the parents too. He stood, energy returning to his voice. We show them what real strength looks like. Not the kind that tears others down, but the kind that builds people up. Over the next week, they developed a workshop series. David used his business presentation skills to create engaging sessions, while Sarah brought her experience as both a parent and widow. They started with Emily's class, expanding to include other grades. The first session was tense. Parents sat with arms crossed, clearly skeptical. But as David and Sarah shared their stories, not of failure, but of resilience, something shifted. A mother spoke about losing her job. A father admitted his struggles with depression. Gradually, judgment gave way to understanding. Emily's participation surprised them both. During the student session, she stood up and spoke about missing her dad but finding new ways to be happy. Her courage inspired other kids to share their own fears and struggles. My mom says it's okay to be sad sometimes, Emily told her classmates, glancing at Sarah with pure love. And Mr. David taught me that starting over can be scary, but it can also be brave. After the sessions, Sarah found David in the empty classroom, staring at the children's artwork on the walls. Emily asked if you're going to be around more now, she said carefully. What did you tell her? That some questions don't have simple answers. Sarah moved closer, but that doesn't mean we stop asking them. The workshop's impact rippled through Millbrook in unexpected ways. Parents who had initially opposed them now approached with questions, seeking advice for their own families. The school board requested regular sessions, and neighboring towns expressed interest in implementing similar programs. David stood at the back of the community center, watching Sarah lead a discussion about grief and change. Her confidence had grown. She spoke with authority born from experience rather than credentials. But it was how she connected with people, truly listening, sharing her own vulnerability, that made her extraordinary. You've got it bad, Betty commented, appearing beside him with coffee. What? The way you look at her. Like she hung the moon. The veteran waitress smiled knowingly. But you're still fighting yourself about it. David accepted the coffee, considering Betty's words. His identity crisis hadn't vanished. He still caught himself comparing his current life to his past. But something fundamental had shifted. The designer suits and corner office no longer defined success for him. Meanwhile, Sarah faced her own evolution. During a quiet evening at the library, she finally removed her wedding ring, placing it carefully in a small box with Tom's photos. Emily asked the process from her homework spot. Are you forgetting Daddy? She asked, her voice small. Sarah pulled her daughter close. Never. But remembering him doesn't mean we can't make room for new happiness. That evening, Sarah called David. Can we talk? They met at the park where they'd first discussed job applications months ago. The autumn air carried a crisp edge, and Sarah wrapped her cardigan tighter around herself. Emily asked about you again, she began. About why you look at me the way her friend's dad looks at her friend's mom. David felt his heart rate accelerate. What did you say? I told her that grown-up feelings are complicated. Sarah turned to face him. But they shouldn't be, should they? We make them complicated because we're scared. Sarah Dash, I took off my ring today, she interrupted. Not because I've forgotten Tom, but because I finally understand what he meant about being happy again. Her eyes met his. I see how you've changed, David. How you've stopped trying to be who you were and started becoming who you are. David stepped closer, drawn by the vulnerability in her voice. And who am I? Someone who makes my daughter laugh, who helps strangers rebuild their lives without expecting anything in return, who looks at me like—" She paused, emotion catching in her throat, "like I'm worth seeing." The moment hung between them, heavy with possibility. David reached for her hand, and this time there was no hesitation in the gesture. "I'm not trying to replace Tom," he said quietly. "I know." Sarah squeezed his hand. "Just like I'm not trying to replace your old life. We're building something new, aren't we?" Before David could respond, his phone buzzed, a message about an emergency at the community center. They shared a look of understanding. Personal revelations would have to wait. Heading to the center, walking close but not quite touching, both felt the shift in their relationship. It wasn't dramatic or sudden, but rather the natural evolution of two people who had learned to trust again, to hope again. The moment David had been rehearsing for weeks finally arrived on a quiet evening at the community center. They'd just finished a successful workshop, and Sarah was gathering her papers, humming softly to herself. The setting sun cast long shadows through the windows, creating a gentle atmosphere that gave him courage. "Would you have dinner with me?" The words tumbled out before he could overthink them. "Not at the diner. Somewhere different." Sarah's hands stilled on her papers. The silence stretched until David nearly retracted the invitation. "Like a date?" she finally asked, her voice carefully neutral. "Yes." David moved closer, heart pounding. "I know it's complicated. With our history, with Emily, with everything. But Sarah, these past months—" He paused, gathering his thoughts. "You've become more than just my friend." Sarah stepped back slightly, creating distance. "David, Her eyes showed conflict. "I can't." The rejection stung, but it was the fear in her eyes that worried him most. "Talk to me," he urged gently. "The last time I let someone in completely, I lost him." Sarah's voice cracked. "I watched him fade away, helpless. Every morning, I woke up knowing it might be our last day together." She wrapped her arms around herself. "I can't do that again." "I'm not Tom," David said softly. "That's exactly the point." Sarah met his gaze. "You're not him. You're someone new, someone who makes me feel things I thought were buried with my husband. And that terrifies me." Before David could respond, his phone rang. The caller ID showed an unknown number, but something made him answer. The news sent him reeling. A massive fire had broken out downtown, destroying several buildings, including the homeless shelter they'd been supporting. They rushed to the scene. Fire trucks illuminated the night, their sirens piercing the usual quiet of Millbrook. Families stood on the sidewalk, clutching whatever possessions they'd managed to save. The sight of children wrapped in emergency blankets, some crying, others simply staring at the smoldering building, hit them both hard. "We need to help them," Sarah said immediately, pushing aside their personal conversation. David nodded, already making calls. They worked through the night, coordinating with emergency services, finding temporary housing, gathering supplies. Their personal tension dissolved in the face of crisis, replaced by the efficient partnership they developed over months. Around dawn, as they distributed coffee and blankets, David caught Sarah watching him organize shelter arrangements. Her expression was complicated, pride mixed with something deeper, more personal. "What?" he asked. "This is why," she said softly. "Why it's terrifying. Because I see you like this, caring, capable, putting others first. And I realize how easy it would be to fall for you completely." She touched his arm briefly. "And how devastating it would be to lose you too." David wanted to argue, to promise he wouldn't leave, but he understood the futility of such promises. Life had taught them both how quickly everything could change. "So what do we do?" he asked instead. Sarah looked at the families they were helping, at the community coming together in crisis. "We keep doing this," she said finally, "helping others, building something meaningful. And maybe," she met his eyes, "maybe we let ourselves be brave enough to see where it leads." During the crisis response for the shelter fire, David received an unexpected letter. It arrived in a weathered envelope, postmarked from his father's attorney's office. Inside, he found a key and a short note explaining that a safe deposit box had been held in trust until this specific date. David almost threw it away, wanting nothing to do with his father's legacy. But Sarah, seeing his hesitation, offered to accompany him to the bank. The safe deposit box contained 2 items: his father's personal journal and a USB drive. That evening, in his apartment, Sarah sat beside him as he began to read. The journal revealed a side of his father he'd never known. The final entries detailed crushing regret, not just for the financial destruction, but for failing his son. The last page contained a confession. He had established a separate, legitimate foundation years ago, completely independent from Hargrove Industries. The USB drive held all the documentation. He created it for community development in small towns, David said, his voice thick with emotion. Towns like Millbrook. All this time, while he was building his empire, he was secretly funding grassroots programs. Sarah touched his hand gently. People aren't just one thing, David. Even those who make terrible mistakes can have moments of grace. The foundation had substantial resources, not the billions of his former life, but enough to make a real difference in their community work. However, the discovery brought new anxiety. What if I corrupt this too? David paced his small apartment. What if I'm more like him than I want to admit? Sarah stood, blocking his path. Stop. You're not your father. The man I know puts others first, works honest hours at a diner, and hasn't once tried to use his name or connections for personal gain. Their proximity was sudden and electric. David could see the flecks of gold in her eyes, the slight tremor in her lips. The man you know, he repeated softly. Yes. Sarah didn't step back. The man who helped my daughter believe in herself again, who showed this town that starting over isn't shameful. She took a deep breath. The man I've fallen in love with, even though it scares me to death. The confession hung between them. David reached up slowly, giving her time to pull away, and touched her cheek. Sarah, I don't want to be afraid anymore, she whispered. Tom taught me about love, about being brave enough to open your heart. Maybe, she leaned into his touch, maybe that was his gift to me, to us. Their first kiss was gentle, tentative, carrying the weight of their shared histories and the promise of something new. When they parted, both had tears in their eyes. What do we tell Emily? David asked. Sarah smiled. She asked me last week if you could come to her father-daughter dance. She said sometimes people get second chances at family. The revelation of his father's secret foundation became a turning point. Using the resources wisely, they expanded their community programs, rebuilt the shelter, and created new opportunities for Millbrook's residents. But the real wealth wasn't in the money. It was in the legacy they were building together. You know what your father wrote in his last entry? Sarah asked one evening, as they watched Emily playing in the community center garden they'd helped create. He said true wealth isn't in what you own, but in what you build for others. David wrapped his arm around her, watching Emily teach younger children how to plant sunflowers. He was right about that, at least. Their story became part of Millbrook's fabric, not as a tale of fall from grace or loss, but as proof that sometimes life's hardest moments lead to its greatest gifts. They had found strength in vulnerability, wealth in simplicity, and love in the courage to begin again. Copy.